Adobe Camera Raw is a really powerful and feature-rich plugin that allows us to non-destructively edit RAW, JPEG and TIFF files with an easy-to-use interface. It's an excellent way to correct color balance, enhance color in tone, convert to black and white, and even add creative special effects. Now, to open a RAW file, I'm going to move from Photoshop to Bridge by selecting File and then Browse in Bridge. In Bridge, I'll select this RAW file and then click on the Open in Camera Raw icon. I would highly recommend that you use Camera Raw to make your images look their best before ever bringing them into Photoshop. In this chapter, we will cover all of the basics. For now, I'll just click Done to return back to the Bridge. There are a number of reasons that you should use Camera Raw to process your files before going into Photoshop and editing them. We will take the next few minutes to talk about 5 top reasons to do this. So the first reason is that everything you do in Camera Raw is non-destructive. It has a completely flexible editing environment, and this means that you can make as many changes that you want to an image, but at any point in time you can alter those changes and you can remove them altogether. The second advantage is that Camera Raw has a built-in workflow. The features that are offered in the sliders, in the panels, they are structured and you can follow them, which takes the guesswork out of what you're supposed to do. Sometimes it's really hard when you open a file in Photoshop to know if you're supposed to use a menu or a toolbar or work with Layers panel. So working through Adobe Camera Raw, it really simplifies what you need to do first to your images in order to optimize them. Another advantage is that Camera Raw supports not only RAW files but also JPEG files and TIFF files. So once you learn all of these different options in Camera Raw dialog, you can quickly apply them to all of these different file formats. Camera Raw can also be automated. It's really easy to apply changes to hundreds of photos at a time. You can synchronize your changes, you can copy and paste settings, and you can even save presets to apply to different photos. Now, obviously Photoshop can be automated, but learning how to create and record actions is much more difficult than simply creating a preset in Camera Raw in order to eliminate those repetitive modifications and adjustments. Finally, Camera Raw has a very simple learning curve. While Photoshop has layers and masks and selections and adjustment layers and is truly powerful, the benefit of using Camera Raw is that you can get up to speed very quickly and you can master all of the tools. So now that we know the advantage of using Camera Raw, it's time to see the workflow in action. There are 2 primary formats that digital cameras can capture today. They are RAW and JPEG. But what can be confusing is that there are a lot of different flavors of RAW. It's sort of a generic term that people use to describe the unprocessed data that the camera captures. For example, Nikon's RAW file format is .nef and Canon's RAW file format is .crw. Now, these RAW file formats are all very similar in that they contain much of the same information, such as metadata about the camera settings and image information, but there's no standard way of writing a RAW file. So each one has its own unique order to data. Now, there is one RAW file format that's not proprietary, and that's the DNG file format. And many people convert their RAW files to DNG because of the fact that it is an openly documented file format, and they do this in the hopes that their files will be open far into the future if they are not kept in a proprietary format. Now, Adobe is the creator of the DNG file format, but it's important to know that if you compare the quality of a RAW file versus a JPEG file, there's much more information in the RAW file. So let's go ahead and select both of these images. Click on one and then hold down the Command key or the Control key and click on the JPEG version of the same document. Then to open them in the Camera Raw, I'll click on Open in Camera Raw icon. I'm also going to put this into full screen mode by clicking on the icon right here to the left of the histogram. Now, capturing in a RAW file format creates images with greater dynamic range, a larger color space, and therefore allows more flexibility in post-processing. You can make larger adjustments, basically to your RAW files, without losing image quality. If you capture in the JPEG file format, well, it does render a smaller file that's faster to download. It forces the camera software to process the file, and while doing so, it's using lossy compression, which throws away thousands of colors and tonal values. The end result is that you can't make as dramatic changes to your JPEG files without losing quality. So basically, capturing in RAW gives you a bigger box of crayons to work with. Let's take a look at this example. Now here I have two images of the same scene, and I'm going to click on the thumbnail for the lighthouse.jpg. I'll go ahead and use the zoom options down here at the bottom, and I'm going to zoom in to 200%. Then I'll hold down the spacebar, and that will allow me to navigate over here to the brighter area of the lighthouse. Now, obviously both of these images were overexposed, but I'm going to use the exposure slider here on the right hand side of the basic panel, and I'm really going to bring down the exposure quite a bit. But you'll notice that no matter how far down I bring down the exposure, there's actually no detail in this highlight area of the lighthouse. Let's go ahead and click on the lighthouse CR2 file. This is the RAW file. Again, I'll use the option down here at the bottom to zoom in to 200%, hold down the spacebar. That temporarily gives me the hand tool so that I can scoot over to view that same area, and this time when I move the exposure slider in the basic panel down to the left, you can see that I'm actually able to recover detail in those highlight areas of the image. Now this isn't to say that you shouldn't do your best to make the correct exposure in camera, it's just to point out that if you need to make changes to your image after the fact, you have more information to work with if you capture that image in RAW. Of course, if you really overexpose your image, then even capturing in RAW might not save you. If there's no information in the highlights, nothing can bring back some things that's not there. Alright, for now, I simply want to cancel out of this dialog box. I don't want these changes to be applied, so I'll click cancel. Then I'll click yes, and I'll return to bridge. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to mention that there are times when capturing JPEGs has its distinct advantages. First of all, the files are going to be much smaller, and like I said before, they are faster to download. Therefore, some experienced photographers, like an event photographer for example, that is photographing each participant at an event with the same background and controlled lighting condition, if they're confident that their images will not need corrections, they might definitely want to capture as JPEG files. But for most of us, I would recommend that if given the option, capture in RAW so that you have the ability to make corrections in post without compromising the image quality. The first thing that we need to do is familiarize ourselves with the Camera Raw interface. So with the water image selected, I'll click on the Open in Camera Raw dialog. Now I've already gone to full screen mode, but if you haven't, it's this icon right here that will go ahead and toggle between the dialog box just coming up in the center and taking up the entire monitor. On the upper left hand corner here, you'll notice that we have all of our different tools. So we have a tool to zoom in, we've got a hand tool that pans around, we also have an eyedropper tool, we have our color sample tool, and our targeted adjustment tool. You'll notice that if you hover your cursor on top of the tool, it gives you a tooltip as well as the keyboard shortcut for the tool in parentheses. So we just saw that the T key would automatically select that targeted adjustment tool for us. Some of the tools also have these little triangles right here. If you click and hold on the tool, you actually get additional options for that tool. So we have our crop tool and our straighten tool. We also have our spot removal tool, our remove red eye, and then we have some localized adjustment tools including a brush, a graduated filter, and a radio filter. We could also quickly take a look at the Camera Raw preferences by clicking here. For now, we'll just click cancel and we can rotate our image using these two icons. In the center, we have our preview area, And in the lower left, we have all of our different zoom options. We can simply click on the minus or the plus icon here, or we can move to a specific zoom level using the pop-up menu right here. There are some great keyboard shortcuts, however, for zooming. If I use Command plus and minus on Mac or Control plus and minus on Windows, this will allow me to zoom in or zoom out of my image. If I use Option Command 0 or Alt Control 0, that will take me quickly to 100%, and if I just want to see the entire image, if I want to go quickly to fit in view, that's just Command 0 or Control 0. I have additional controls over here on the right. I've got my histogram as well as my clipping warnings in the upper left and upper right. I have a number of different camera settings here, and I have all of my different panels. So for example, here in the basic panel, we can change our white balance, or we could change our exposure. I could even do something as simple as adding vibrance to this image. Of course, there are many other panels. We've got our tone curve panel, we've got our details panel, HSL in grayscale for making color conversions or desaturating selective color ranges. We can add color tints with split toning. We can make lens corrections as well as perspective correction, plus add special effects here including dehaze, grain and post-crop vignetting. There are also some camera calibration options. We can create and save presets which would appear here as well as snapshots. Right now I'll return back to the basic panel and let's move back over to the lower left here. If I was done making changes to my image and just wanted to save that as a JPEG, I could use the Save Image option without having to take my photo to Photoshop to edit it. That on the upper right of the thumbnail here in Bridge, I know that this image now has changes applied by Camera Raw by this little icon right here. So there you go, a quick tour of the Camera Raw interface. We're going to take a minute and look at some of the basic adjustments that you can make in Camera Raw. So with the Rox image selected, I'll click on the Open in Camera Raw icon. Now I'm going to be staying just within the basic panel, but there are many other panels that we can use in order to refine and make enhancements to our image. But for right now, let's stay in basic. At the top you can see that we have many different ways to change the white balance. I can either select from the menu here if I wanted to change the white balance, or I can move the temperature or the tint slider. So moving the temperature slider over to the right, you can see adds warmth or adds yellow to the image. But in this case, I actually prefer the image to look a little bit cooler. So I'm going to move the temperature slider back down a little ways to the left. We can also change the tint slider. It goes from green on the left to more magenta on the right. Now, if you want to reset any of these sliders at any point, all you need to do is double click on the slider itself in order for it to be reset to the Camera Raw default or to the state of the image when you brought it into Camera Raw. Down below, there are a number of different sliders that will help us to change the tonal values in the image. We can click on the auto option so that the Camera Raw does an auto correction of the image. We can then start refining any of these sliders, or we could just reset it by clicking on default. Now, the exposure slider, when I move it to the left, is going to decrease exposure. When I move it to the right, it will increase the exposure. We can use the contrast slider to either decrease or increase the contrast of our image, again just double clicking on the slider itself if we want to reset it. The highlight slider allows us to adjust the brighter areas in our image. If we move it to the left, it's going to darken them down. Moving it to the right will open up those shadow areas. Now in this case, I want to use it in combination with the white slider. The white slider allows me to set the brightest white in my image. So first, I'll move my white slider over to the right in order to set that brightest point. Now, I'm using the histogram in order to judge that. I want the histogram to show information all the way from the left to the right. Now remember, this is just an overview. I just want to show the kinds of corrections we can do, and each of these features will be talked about more in depth later in this course. For now, since I've set the white so bright, if I wanted to regain some detail in this highlight areas, I would move my highlight slider down to the left. If I want to see more information in the shadow area, if I want to brighten those up, I would use my shadow slider and I can move that over to the right. And now we can see detail in those dark areas of the rock. We also have the black slider. This is going to help us set the darkest value in our image. In this case, I'm going to just move it up a bit. Now, we also have clarity, vibrance and saturation. Clarity is a great way to add a little bit of sharpness. It's actually adding some contrast to your image. We can move that to the right, or we can actually decrease the clarity, making the water look like it's even more in motion than before. The vibrance slider is one way to increase or decrease the amount of color in your image. If I double click on that, you can see that we can do the same thing. I can increase the saturation or decrease the saturation in my image. However, the saturation slider is a much stronger slider than vibrance. Again, I'll just double click on that to reset it. Now, if I wanted to preview the before image, I could tap the P key and that shows me the before. If I tap the P key again, that shows me the after. So there you go, a quick overview of some of the types of changes that you can make using the basic panel in Camera Raw. When you're ready to open up your image in Photoshop, you're going to want to make sure that you pay attention to the workflow settings. So with the Bouis image selected in Bridge, I'm going to use Command R or Control R in order to open this into Camera Raw. Now, after you make all of your adjustments and you're ready to open the image, you need to make sure that before you do, you check your workflow settings. You access the workflow settings by clicking on this hyperlink and that brings up the options. The first option is for color space. Color spaces are quite a complex topic, but I'm going to simplify it a little bit here. Color spaces are quite a complex topic, but I'm going to simplify it a little bit here. The sRGB color space, that's going to be the smallest color space out of these first four color spaces, and it's the color space that you would most often find online or on the web. So if you were creating images solely to be distributed online, you certainly could use the sRGB color space for your workflow. However, I think that you might be disappointed because you're limiting how many colors you have in the image if you were going to print that image. So for this course, I'm going to select the Adobe RGB color space, that is a larger color space than the sRGB color space. It has more colors in it and will be able to print those additional colors. Now, if you were looking for a color space that has even a greater number of colors in it, then you could certainly choose ProPhoto. However, one little caveat with ProPhoto is that there's actually so many colors in ProPhoto, but you can't always accurately display those colors on your monitor. So when you do print an image, you might see a discrepancy between what you're looking at, assuming that your monitor is calibrated, and the print that you print out. So I think Adobe RGB is a really good happy medium for color spaces because of all the colors in Adobe RGB we can see on our monitor. So we'll select that for color space and then we have our bit depth. You have the option between 8 and 16 bits. When you're handing off your images to Photoshop, I would recommend that you work in 16-bit because there's more information per pixel than if you work in 8-bit. Now the file size will be larger, but I think file size is a small price to pay for better quality and more latitude when working and making adjustments. Now as far as image sizing goes, you can either hand off the image as large as the original image is in Camera Raw by leaving this unchecked, or we can check it in order to determine a specific file size. So for example, if I knew that I wanted to hand this off at 6 inches wide by 300 pixels per inch, I would select long side and then change my units of measurement to inches and enter in 6 inches with a resolution of 300 pixels per inch. Now the reason I selected long side is because there might be times when you're working with a number of different images and some of them might be horizontal and some of them might be vertical, And what this tells Camera Raw is that for horizontal images, the long side would be the width, but when it gets to a vertical image, it should keep the vertical side or the height of the image 6 inches. So for right now, let's go ahead and just uncheck Resize to Fit, and that will allow Camera Raw to hand off the entire image to Photoshop without resizing it. We can also choose to include output sharpening. You'll notice that once you enable it, you can choose the sharpening for screen, glossy or matte paper, and then you can dial in the amount low, standard or high. However, if you're gonna hand this image off to Photoshop to continue editing it, I wouldn't want to add my sharpening now. I'd want to toggle this off, and then when I'm finished doing all of my edits, I'll want to sharpen my image in Photoshop for the specific output device, whether it was on screen or the printer. The last option here, to open the raw file as a smart object in Photoshop, is beyond the scope of this course but is covered in the Photoshop Essential Training class. Let's click OK and we can see that our workflow settings have changed. We now have the Adobe RGB 1998 in 16-bit, and we've got the dimensions of this file as it would open into Photoshop when I click on Open Image. So as we can see, these workflow settings are really important, but they're so easy to overlook because it's just this small hyperlink down here at the bottom.